Imagine waking up, not in a bed, but on a packed earth floor, maybe with some scratchy straw for comfort. The air is thick with the smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and human waste. Your first and maybe only meal of the day isn't some hearty breakfast, but a lukewarm bowl of tasteless, gritty barley gruel. You wash it down with wine so watered down it's barely recognizable. The water itself is a total gamble, often contaminated and teeming with invisible death. Step outside, and you're not greeted by poets and playwrights. You're greeted by the threat of disease, the stench of open sewers, and the very real possibility that your neighbor might just kill you over a property dispute. This was the real ancient Greece. And the hard truth is, you wouldn't have made it. That golden age of philosophy, democracy, and art that we all romanticize was built on a foundation of unimaginable hardship, filth, and brutality. For the average person, life was a daily, relentless struggle for survival against forces that would crush the modern spirit and break the modern body. In this video, we're stripping away the marble veneer to expose the grim reality. We'll break down the brutal truths of daily existence, from the constant threat of war and the cruelty of the legal system to the filth of the cities and the ever-present shadow of slavery. By the end, you'll see exactly why your chances of making it in the world of Plato and Pericles were slim to none. Let's start with the most fundamental thing: your home and your health. The very idea of a comfortable, private, and sanitary living space would have been totally alien to most ancient Greeks. Your home, your oikos, would likely be a small, cramped, and flimsy shack. Most houses weren't built from sturdy brick and stone, but from unbaked mud bricks on a timber frame. These structures were so weak they offered almost no protection from the weather, and even less from other people. Burglars didn't bother with picking locks. They'd just kick a hole straight through your wall. The Greeks even had a specific name for this kind of thief: a toikourokos, or wall digger. Home security was a joke. Doors and their frames were so valuable that thieves might just steal the entire door right out of your house. Inside, forget privacy. A typical house was just a few small dark rooms around a central courtyard that was open to the sky. And that courtyard wasn't some charming garden. It was your kitchen, your workshop, and your bathroom, all rolled into one. You'd share this tiny space with your entire family across generations, and probably a slave or two, all living and working right on top of each other. The floors were just packed earth, which turned to mud when it rained and dust when it was hot. Furniture was minimal: a few wooden stools, maybe a chest, and straw mats to sleep on. But the real horror of daily life was the staggering lack of sanitation. For most of Greek history, there was no public sewage system. Waste, both human and animal, was just chucked into the streets or dumped in open pits. The stench, especially in the sweltering summer heat, would have been a constant, nauseating assault. Some richer homes had a designated latrine, which was just a hole in the ground leading to a cesspit under the house. These pits were rarely emptied and were often located dangerously close to the kitchen or the family well, creating a perfect breeding ground for disease. While some cities like Athens had rudimentary drainage channels, they were primarily for rainwater and did little to manage the overwhelming filth. Clean water, the most basic necessity, was a luxury. While the rich might have had water piped into their homes, the poor had to get it from public fountains. These sources were often contaminated by runoff from the streets, leading to constant outbreaks of diseases like typhoid and dysentery. Bathing was rare. Public baths were more of a social club for men than a place for actual hygiene, and could be breeding grounds for bacteria themselves. For most people, a bath was a quick wash with a basin of cold water in the courtyard. Unsurprisingly, this world of filth meant disease was everywhere. and life expectancy was brutal. The often quoted average of 30 years is misleading because it's dragged down by an astronomical infant mortality rate. Many as 1 in 3 babies didn't survive their first year. If you made it through childhood, you had a decent shot at living into your 60s or 70s, but your health would be a constant worry. The Greeks had no clue about germ theory. They believed sickness came from an imbalance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This led to medical cures that were often more dangerous than the disease. A doctor might see your fever, diagnose you with too much blood, and prescribe bloodletting, weakening you right when you needed strength. Surgery was a terrifying last resort, done with basic iron tools and no anesthetic. The word for it, chirurgia, literally means curing by cutting and burning. Even a small cut could fester into a deadly infection. For women, the theories were even wilder. Plato argued the uterus was a separate creature that could wander around the body if a woman went too long without getting pregnant, causing everything from dizziness to suffocation. The prescribed cure: get pregnant. So, your reality would be life in a cramped, filthy, insecure home, surrounded by diseases you couldn't understand, and treated by doctors whose cures were just as likely to kill you. Forget those vibrant Mediterranean feasts overflowing with olives, figs, and roasted meats. For most people in ancient Greece, food wasn't about pleasure or variety. It was about staving off starvation with the most monotonous, meager diet you can imagine. Your entire culinary world would be dominated by one thing: barley. Barley was the fuel of the masses. You'd eat it every single day, for pretty much every single meal. The most common dish was a thick, lumpy porridge called maza. That was your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was bland, gritty, and often it was all you had. Sometimes the barley was cooked into dense, hard flatbreads. Soft, white wheat bread was a luxury for the rich. Your protein intake would be pitiful. Meat was a rare treat, something you might only taste a few times a year at religious festivals where animals were sacrificed and the meat was handed out. And even then, you'd be lucky to get a few scraps. The most common source of protein for those near the coast was fish, and usually the cheapest, smelliest kinds like sardines and anchovies, heavily salted so they wouldn't rot on the way inland. For the truly poor, the diet was supplemented with whatever you could forage: wild greens, roots, snails, even acorns. Lentils and chickpeas were critical, often boiled into a thick stew that was a staple meal. To give this bland food any flavor, you'd have olive oil, which was a cornerstone of the Greek world, providing essential fats. You might also have onions and garlic. But one of the most common flavorings was a sauce called garum, a potent, fermented fish sauce made by leaving fish guts and small fish to rot in salt for months. The resulting liquid was powerfully salty and pungent, and it was splashed on everything. Imagine the taste of your barley gruel enhanced with fermented fish gut juice. Your daily drink would be wine, but not the kind we think of. You drink it heavily diluted with water, often 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking wine straight was considered barbaric. This wasn't just about moderation. The alcohol had a mild antiseptic effect that made the often unclean water safer to drink. This diet was also incredibly precarious. The Greek landscape is rocky and the soil isn't great. A single bad harvest or a drought could cause widespread famine, a constant fear that shaped their entire culture. There were no global supply chains to fall back on. If your local crops failed, you starved. The glorious symposiums of the philosophers were a world away from your reality, which was a grinding quest for enough calories to see the next sunrise. The first light of dawn in ancient Greece did not so much arrive as creep quietly over the stone hills, filtering through olive branches and painting the cracked earth in a pale grayish gold. There were no clocks. There were no alarms. Only the call of roosters echoing through narrow alleyways and open fields. Their cries marked the beginning of yet another day, indistinguishable from the last, predictable, necessary, and without luxury. A man, perhaps a humble farmer or a craftsman, would stir on his bedding. There was no mattress, not in the way we know them now. Just layers of straw, perhaps softened by old wool, flattened by years of use and the weight of exhaustion. The house, made of clay or stone, was still cold from the night. The hearth had long gone cold. There was no insulation, no fire to greet him, just silence, the smell of earth, and the faintest glimmer of light through a wooden shutter or a hole in the wall. He would not stretch. He would not scroll a glowing device or reach for anything comforting. He would simply rise, feet finding the dirt-packed floor, joints aching from another night on the hard surface. If he was lucky, he had not been awakened by fleas or the sounds of a neighbor's livestock in the night. If he was less lucky, perhaps rats had rustled through what remained of his stored grains. Life was not designed for rest. It was designed for survival. Nearby, his wife may already be up. Her duties, though different, were just as relentless. She would begin by preparing a small fire, blowing gently into the charcoal ashes from the night before. No matches, no convenience, just patience, breath, and the skill of coaxing flame from nothing. Over time, a few sparks would grow, and with a handful of dried twigs and maybe a bundle of olive wood, the fire would take. The warmth would come slowly. But warmth was not the goal boiling water was, and this was no simple task. Water had to be drawn, usually from a public fountain or well, carried in ceramic jugs from the town's edge to the household. That task often fell to her or the children. The children, if old enough to walk, would rise with the family. Boys would shadow their fathers, learning the ways of labor and discipline. Girls would remain close to their mothers, learning the rhythm of household work, the art of weaving, grinding grain, kneading dough. Childhood was not a time of play. It was an apprenticeship in survival. If the family lived in a village or on the outskirts of a polis, the scene might shift. The home could be nothing more than a single-room structure shared by several people. Privacy was a foreign concept. Bodies moved in silence, dodging one another in tight spaces, performing daily rituals like a practiced dance. The morning meal was sparse, barley bread, dry and crumbling, dipped in diluted wine or olive oil, maybe a few olives, preserved from last season. Cheese, if any remained, was prized and saved. There were no sugary cereals, no eggs and bacon, no hot coffee or sweet milk. Only what could be made with the least amount of effort and the fewest ingredients. No meal was guaranteed, and nothing was wasted. Outside, the streets were quiet, but not for long. Merchants would soon begin setting up their stalls, laying out goods on wooden carts or stone benches. The Agorath marketplace would come alive slowly, voices rising with the sun, neighbors exchanging greetings that masked hardship with formality. Men would head to the fields or their workshops. Women would disappear back into their homes, their presence in the streets limited and controlled. But before any of that, before the tools were picked up or the looms were strung, there was one duty that often came first: worship. At a small household shrine near the hearth, a pinch of flour or a drop of oil might be offered to the gods. Hestia, guardian of the hearth. Hermes, protector of travelers. Zeus, overseer of all. The offering was more about tradition than hope. In a world with little safety net, divine favor was the only comfort they knew. As the sky turned bluer and the sun grew warmer, the rhythm of the day began in earnest. If the man was a farmer, he would grab his worn wooden tools, perhaps a crude hoe or sickly, and walk toward his fields. Sandals slapped against the packed earth. His garments, made of rough wool and tied with a simple rope, offered little protection from the elements. Cold in the morning, hot by midday. There was no dressing for comfort, only for function. The land was not generous. It demanded coaxing, pleading, persistence. The soil was rocky and dry. Irrigation was minimal. Crops like barley, olives, and grapes were chosen not for taste, but for endurance. Plowing the land was a slow, exhausting process, often done with the help of a mule or ox, if one could afford it. If not, it was done by hand, inch by inch, row by row. The city dwellers' morning looked different, but no less grueling. In Athens or Corinth, craftsmen would open shop potters, metalworkers, carpenters. The sound of hammers and chisels would fill narrow alleyways. Apprentices would scramble to clean and prepare materials. The work was monotonous, but it was life. There was no real retirement, no safety if injured. If your hands could no longer work, you were dependent on the goodwill of family or the streets. The wealthy woke later. They had slaves to fetch water, light fires, prepare meals. But even wealth could not keep out disease, discomfort, or the constant threats of political unrest. Even in a well-appointed home, the stone floors remained cold. Insects were unbothered by static, and rumors always made their way into marble halls, whispered through servants' mouths, or overheard in public baths. No one was truly insulated. Back in the countryside, the children were not idle. The boys were sometimes tasked with guarding livestock or collecting kindling. The girls often joined their mothers at the loom, weaving cloth that would later be dyed and sewn by hand. Weaving was more than art, it was necessity. Clothing wore out quickly, and there were no stores to buy replacements. Everything took time, and time was in short supply. As the morning stretched on, the sun climbed higher and brought with it the dryness of the season. Sweat gathered beneath rough tunics. Flies buzzed lazily in the heat. Farmers took small breaks beneath trees, chewing on dried figs or stale bread. There was little water to spare, and no one wasted energy on unnecessary speech. Time was marked not by the hour, but by the position of the sun. And though the work felt endless, it was known that stopping early meant hunger later. Midday approached, and with it the first signs of fatigue. Muscles ached, eyes squinted against the brightness, but no one stopped fully. There were no weekends, no holidays beyond the sacred festivals, and even those required preparation. Life moved in slow, grinding circles, and each morning was another turn of the wheel. For the visitor who had suddenly found themselves waking in this world, the adjustments would have been brutal. No comfort, no privacy, no warmth or entertainment, just survival. Each morning offered a test not of ambition, but of endurance. Could one rise again, dress in scratchy wool, drink warm, metallic water, and pretend it was enough? Could one accept that this narrow existence was all there was? And yet, there was something strangely calming in the routine, the predictability, the shared struggle, the silence of dawn broken only by roosters, and the careful clatter of pottery. It was a life stripped bare to the bone, raw, real, and unforgiving. But within that simplicity, there was rhythm. There was the beating of a heart that knew its place in the world, however small. And when the morning ended and the sun crossed its halfway mark, the people of ancient Greece did what they always did. They pressed on, they worked, they endured, and they waited for the sun to fall again so they could begin it all once more. You awaken to the early groan of the town around you, the same as yesterday and the day before. There is no rooster to crow. They have been quiet lately, maybe taken for stew. The air is cool but not gentle. and it tastes of dust and the dampness of dawn. In the small clay dwelling that you've now come to call yours bare, and sun-bleached your joints, ache not from the straw mat, but from the labor that filled the hours before sleep. The hearth is cold. It always is in the mornings. There's no wood to waste. You rub your shoulders beneath your woven tunic, wondering if today will bring something new, but knowing it won't. Today is a laboring day, and so is tomorrow. Outside, the alleys between homes of sun-baked brick come alive with the sound of sandals scuffing dry earth and hushed greetings. Not cheerful greetings, those are reserved for celebrations, but the shared rhythm of another day survived. These streets are not paved, they're just well trodden. You walk carefully, dodging the uneven ridges, and refuse. At every step, there's a soft cloud of dust that clings to your skin, a reminder that all roads in this village belong to the earth more than to the people. You're not special. Everyone works. There's no prestige in labor. There is only work, and then rest, and then more work. Your hands aren't calloused yet like the others, but you can already feel the roughening. You've begun to understand what true weariness feels like, and not the weariness of lost sleep or long walks, but the deep, grinding fatigue that settles in the bones and stays there. The kind of tired that doesn't leave, even after you wake. Men gather tool splows, sickles, ropes. Those lucky enough to have animals prepare carts or oxen. Others prepare only themselves. A group of them will walk miles today, carrying baskets of olives and amphorae of wine to the agora. They won't sell it themselves, though. That's the domain of merchants, who hold power simply because they speak quickly and know how to trade. You, on the other hand, are just one more person helping the system keep turning. The olives won't press themselves, the fields won't tend themselves, the fish won't gut themselves. Everything needs hands. There is no breakfast, not really. A scrap of leftover barley cake and a small swallow of watered wine, perhaps. Sometimes figs if you're fortunate. You chew slowly, as if that can make it last longer. But it's not enough to fill you. It never is. Food is a tool, like anything else. Just enough to keep you upright, just enough to keep your limbs moving. Hunger is a steady companion, familiar and tolerable. You step into the field with the others. The sun is already climbing, and you squint against the light. It will burn today. It always burns. There's no shade in the olive groves, and the work is slow. It takes skill, oddly enough, to pick without bruising, to twist each fruit from the branch just right. One wrong turn, and the entire harvest spoils faster. You've seen it before. You've heard the shouting. You've watched people get beaten or sent away for less. Time doesn't pass here like it does in modern life. There's no clock ticking. There's only the sun and the shadows it casts. Morning stretches long, each hour marked not by the hands of a watch, but by the dryness of your throat, the ache in your back, the number of blisters you can feel forming between your fingers. Some of the younger children run errands fetching water, chasing chickens, carrying baskets. They don't laugh when they work. That's a fantasy for modern stories. Their laughter is saved for the quiet moments, rare and fleeting. Here, children are small adults, expected to contribute as soon as they can walk straight. There's no protection from the grind. Childhood is a formality, not a sanctuary. Nearby, fishermen return from the shore, dragging nets that stink of salt and scale. Their eyes are hollow from a night of rowing and waiting. Their catch is meager today, again. They mutter about currents and luck, but their hands are already working, mending the tears in the net before night returns and the cycle repeats. You offer to help, and they hand you the twine. Your fingers struggle, but you try. You always try. There's dignity in that, even if no one says so. Lunch is a shared thing, barely a meal. Bread, if there's enough to go around, maybe a smear of cheese. Most days, it's just pulseless lentils or chickpeas, boiled until they turn to mush. You eat with your hands, seated on the ground. The dirt gets everywhere, in your nails, on your food, in your mouth, but you get used to it. It becomes part of the taste, a gritty reminder of where you are and what you are. Afternoons are hotter. The sun bears down like judgment, and there's no shelter. You wrap a cloth over your head and shoulders, not to keep warm, but to stave off sunstroke. The heat is not just oppressive, it's spiritual. It presses on your soul. You begin to understand why people in these times worship the sun. It demands fear, and it receives it. As the day draws on, you trade one chore for another. The women gather to spin and weave. You watch, then join. Your hands are clumsy, but they're patient with you. The rhythm of the spinning wheel is hypnotic. It's the first time all day you don't feel like you're fighting the world. For a moment, you can pretend this is enough, that labor can be soft, that life can be woven slowly. Later still, others go to market. They carry goods on their backs, sweating through tunics patched a dozen times over. The agora is noisy, crowded, chaotic. Men shouting, goats bleating, coin clinking. There's a bitter energy here, an undercurrent of desperation masked as business. Every trader hopes to come out ahead. Every buyer hopes to not be cheated. No one trusts each other. Deals are made with one hand and a dagger hidden behind the other. You walk past stalls of pottery, oil, meat hung on strings, herbs in crumbling baskets. There's not much color, not much flair, just necessities. You notice a man bartering for a small amphora of wine. He raises his voice, gesturing wildly, and the seller waves him off. Moments later, the two are laughing. That's how it goes here. Emotion is a currency, displayed just enough to get your way, but not so much that it costs you your pride. As dusk approaches, the crowd thins. The merchants pack their goods. You begin your walk home, slower now. Your limbs protest. Your feet throb. You think about water, about the cold splash from the clay basin, about the scratchy blanket waiting for you. Home is quiet. Smoke drifts from neighboring chimneys. You kneel to stir the hearth back to life, coaxing flame from ember. The others arrive one by one, each marked by the day. You don't speak much. Words are costly when you're tired. Instead, you sit, eat what little there is, and stare into the fire. The night offers no luxuries, no baths, no music, no softness, just sleep, and even that isn't easy. The floor is hard, the air is cold, the insects find their way in. You listen to the night sounds, the low mutter of neighbors, a dog barking in the distance, the distant hoot of an owl. You close your eyes, but your body keeps working, digesting the pain, storing it for tomorrow. You fall asleep, knowing that tomorrow will be the same, no less harsh, no more forgiving, just another chapter in the long, quiet book of survival. There was no warm water waiting in a tiled bathroom, no soap that smelled of lavender, no faucet to twist or mirror to fog. In ancient Greece, the care of the body was a daily affair. Yes, but it bore little resemblance to modern hygiene. To live in that time was to inhabit a world where the line between health and harm was invisible, and much of what we now understand about sanitation and medicine was either misunderstood or altogether unknown. In the early morning hours, long before the sun poured over the dusty courtyards of Athens or the sleepy fields of Thessaly, a person stirred from a bed made of straw, perhaps with a woven mat atop it if they were lucky. There were no toothbrushes, no soft bristles, no minty pastes, some chewed aromatic twigs. Others scrubbed their teeth with crushed bones or oyster shells. their grit scouring away more enamel than plaque, and still others used nothing at all. A smile, if one had teeth to smile with, might reveal years of wear and the stains of diluted wine and coarse bread. Water was precious. It did not come from pipes hidden in walls, but from wells and fountains, from cisterns filled by rain. The richer households might boast a rudimentary plumbing system, with clay pipes guiding water through the home. The poorer folk, most of the population, carried it in amphorae, heavy and awkward, hauled back to the home on tired shoulders. Washing was not private, nor particularly frequent. The body was wiped clean with cloth and oil. Soap, as we know it, did not yet exist. Instead, olive oil was the cleanser of choice poured, rubbed, scraped away with a curved strigil made of bronze or bone. And this, only if you had the means. Bathing, when it occurred, was more ritual than necessity. The gymnasiums of the cities had wash basins and communal baths. Yes, but these were not the daily luxury one might assume. To sweat and stink was natural. The human body was a vessel of toil and of nature. To be clean was not so much a virtue as it was a preparation for feast, for love, for battle. And then there were the ailments. Insect bites turned to infections. Cuts festered. The wrong diet could swell the belly, dim the eyes. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics. The most common diseases were mysterious forces, assigned names but not causes. A cough might be the result of unbalanced humorous blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or perhaps the wrath of Apollo. A fever was not a symptom but a sickness in itself. Physicians, if one could afford to summon them, offered treatments rooted more in philosophy than in fact. They might bleed a patient to calm an excess of blood, or recommend vomiting to purge corrupted food. Leeches were not just for drawing blood, but for restoring balance to the entire body. The famed Hippocrates, whose name still graces the oath sworn by modern doctors, did advocate observation and cleanliness. But his tools were crude, and his understanding of the body, though revolutionary for the time, was limited. Surgery was rare and terrifying. Without anesthesia, without sterile tools, without any true understanding of anatomy, the knife was feared as much as the disease. In homes, the responsibility for healing often fell to women mothers, wives, daughters. They knew the properties of herbs: sage to soothe a sore throat, garlic to fight rot, wine to cleanse a wound. But this knowledge was passed down by practice, not by study. Mistakes were frequent. Superstition lingered at every turn. Amulets were worn to ward off spirits. Incantations were muttered in low voices over sickbeds. It was not uncommon for someone to be treated with a mixture of honey and ashes, or to be laid out under moonlight with prayers to Artemis. And hygiene was not just about cleanliness. It was about the body's balance with nature and the cosmos. The seasons played a role. The stars had influence. Some believed that the body could fall ill if exposed to the wrong wind. The north wind, it was said, chilled the bones. The east wind stirred up melancholy. These ideas guided not only treatment but daily behavior. A man might delay travel not because of weather, but because the alignment of winds and omens was unfavorable. A woman might avoid cooking certain foods during particular lunar phases for fear it would sour the stomachs of her children. Waste disposal was a problem rarely discussed, but always present. In cities like Athens, chamber pots were emptied into the streets or into rudimentary sewers that barely functioned. The smell was ever present. Flies swarmed, rats scurried. Outbreaks of illness would flare and fade, often without explanation. Sanitation was communal in its failure. No one person could escape it. Filth was democratic in that way. The elderly suffered doubly. Their bodies, worn by labor and time, were not coddled in warm baths or aided by soft beds. Arthritis, failing vision, tooth decay, these were endured without aid, without comfort. The pain of aging was folded into daily life like the cracks in a clay pot. Expected, inevitable, accepted. Children too bore the marks of a world without hygiene. Fevers took them, sores lingered, parasites were common. Life expectancy was low, not because people did not value life, but because nature was unrelenting. Death came in infancy, in childhood, in childbirth, in fields, in alleys, in war. To survive past adolescence was an achievement. To do so in good health was rare. And yet, people lived. They laughed. They loved. They endured. They wrapped themselves in wool cloaks and stepped barefoot through cold courtyards. They scrubbed themselves with oil and ash and told stories while the fire crackled low. They believed in balance, in the humors, in the gods who watched from Olympus and intervened when they pleased. Perhaps the most sobering truth is that what they lacked in knowledge they made up for in resilience. In their minds they were not dirty, they were not diseased. They were humans in harmony with a universe they did not yet fully understand. And within that misunderstanding lay a kind of peace strange and quiet and all too human. So, if you found yourself waking in ancient Greece, groggy beneath a rough woolen blanket, blinking into the smoky morning light, you might seek a bath. You might look for a toothbrush. You might wonder where the soap is. And in all that looking, you'd find not just a different time, but a different idea of what it means to care for the body, to wash it, to mend it, to survive within it. And so, the morning passes, the olive oil gleams in the sun, the strigil is scraped with care, and the myths of medicine and the rhythm of daily grime blend into one long, slow, and necessary chapter of life, in a world not built for comfort but for enduring. The morning haze lingers over the uneven rooftops of the Greek polis. If you had hoped for bright courtyards of marble and polished columns, as artists might depict on modern postcards, you would be sorely disappointed. Your feet find uneven purchase on dusty stone as you walk down a narrow path between clay-built homes. It is not even really a street, more a compressed corridor between rough walls that sweat in the summer and shudder in the rain. The air here is still, except when stirred by hurried footsteps or drifting smoke from an unseen hearth. Homes in ancient Greece were built less for comfort and more for necessity. The typical dwelling of the common person, the demos, was not the opulent temple of comfort you might imagine. Built from sun-dried mud brick and timber, the houses were fragile, always at odds with the seasons. Rain might slowly melt the walls, and heat would turn the interior into a kind of oven. The floors were dirt, sometimes packed tight, but often simply dusty. On dry days, the air filled with the floating particles of lived-in soil. In colder months, that same dust turned to clinging mud underfoot. Step inside, and your eyes would need time to adjust. Natural light was not welcomed freely into these homes. Openings were narrow and few, mostly positioned high up to preserve security and privacy rather than illumination. You might find a small wooden shutter or a cloth covering to block out the sun, but more often than not, it was shadow that reigned within. The hearth was the heart of the home, but its flame offered little light beyond a flicker. Smoke clung to the ceiling, staining it black over the years, mingling with the smell of old meals and humanity. Rooms were sparse. There were few possessions. A loom, perhaps, resting in a corner, its threads half-woven and dusty. Baskets of grain or legumes, stored to stretch the family through lean weeks. Clay pots of varying sizes lined one wall, some filled with oil, others with dried herbs or wine. Furnishings were more suggestion than substance. Stools of uneven wood, a table too low and too narrow, sleeping mats rolled and kept out of the way until nightfall. There were no closets, no soft bedding, no cushioned chairs, just woven mats and sheepskin throws if the family could afford them. In wealthier homes, there might be rooms arranged around a small open courtyard, the oli, where cooking and socializing could take place beneath the sky. But this was a luxury. For most, the home was a cramped place, where one space served many purposes. Families cooked, worked, slept, and often shared space with animals. Chickens might wander through the threshold. Goats could be tied near the entry. Children, barefooted and quick, darted through every crevice. At night, the home became a different kind of world. Shadows deepened. Oil lamps flickered but did little to dispel the overwhelming gloom. The flame licked the thick wick slowly, casting soft, trembling shapes on cracked walls. The silence of the house was punctuated only by the occasional cough, the creak of wood, the restless stirring of someone on their mat. Privacy was unknown. Modesty, a luxury. Families slept near one another, sometimes in the same room, sometimes even in the same bedding arrangement if it was cold enough. The night was long, and rest was always partial. One ear always open for the wail of a sick child, the bark of a dog, the shuffling of feet outside that did not belong. In the summers, the heat within these walls was unbearable. With no glass windows, no circulating air, the night became a smothering blanket. People sometimes slept outside on the roof, risking dew, insects, and the occasional unwelcome animal, just for a breath of coolness. Winter brought its own host of discomforts. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden doors, whistled between the roof tiles, and sent cold fingers down the backs of sleeping inhabitants. Fires were not always kept burning all night. Fuel was precious. Often, the hearth's warmth dwindled into a fading orange hush before the middle of the night arrived. You might expect sanitation to be separate from domestic life, but here again, the ancient Greek home disappoints. Chamber pots were the norm. These were emptied into the street or nearby alleys. Some neighborhoods had latrines, but many did not. Clean water was fetched from public fountains or wells. Wastewater, meanwhile, was flung out or drained through cracks and corners. Illness spread easily in such environments. Dysentery, fevers, skin conditions, and parasitic infections were common companions of domestic life. There was no plumbing. There were no bathtubs in most homes. Bathing, if done, was occasional, and sometimes performed at public bathhouses, if one existed. Washing clothes was a difficult and water-consuming task, often saved for specific days, and done by women or enslaved laborers. The scent of a home was not floral or clean. It was the musk of bodies, smoke, ash, oils, food remnants, and, at times, decay, and it was a smell that never entirely left the skin. For a visitor from the modern world, these homes would feel foreign, uncomfortable, perhaps claustrophobic. The notion of a safe, clean, private space did not exist in this form. The home was a place of survival, of utility, not comfort or pleasure. Even so, it was precious. It was the only shield against the world outside. It offered some measure of familiarity, of structure. Here, mothers rocked their children to sleep. Here, elders whispered stories by firelight. Here, people dreamed, even if those dreams were often interrupted by the cold or a dripping roof. And still, despite all this, life continued. Meals were cooked, bread was baked, gossip was traded, infants were born and elders passed away, all within the same compact walls. These homes bore witness to generations of struggle, to seasons of drought, to fleeting moments of laughter and the long hush of mourning. If the walls could speak, they would sigh heavily, not from weariness, but from the weight of the unremarkable, unstoppable current of human life. So you might lie down, in your mind's eye, on a straw-stuffed mat in the corner of this home. You might watch the wavering shadows cast by the final glow of a lamp. You might listen to the slow breathing of others, and to the distant howling of wild dogs outside the city. The floor is hard, the air is thick, but it is sleep all the same. This is not the sleep of luxury or peace, but of necessity. Because tomorrow will come, and the fields will need tilling, the pots will need filling, and the small, unglamorous rhythm of ancient life will hum on again. The sun had barely begun its slow climb over the jagged hills surrounding the polis, yet already the hum of life had started to stir within the crooked alleyways and open courtyards of the ancient Greek town. Thin beams of light filtered through the cracks in stone walls and wooden shutters, casting gentle golden stripes across worn floors of hardened clay and straw. The air was still, thick with the scents of old olive oil, crumbling lime mortar, and the faint hint of the previous evening's hearth smoke. A single rooster crowed, its cry distant and disjointed, lost amid the shuffle of sandals and the creak of crude doors being pushed open on unsteady hinges. Within the modest dwellings of artisans, farmers, and fishermen, the day began not with haste, but with necessity. Life in ancient Greece, especially for those not fortunate enough to be born into the leisure of the Aristoi, was a continuous cycle of preparation and endurance. The morning was quiet and practical. There were no gentle wake-up calls, no leisurely stretches beneath warm blankets. Sleep was shallow and often broken. Dreams gave way to the hard certainty of responsibility, as men, women, and children alike stirred beneath thin woven blankets, rising not from comfort but from obligation. For a common citizen or medic in Athens or Corinth, the first tasks of the day were simple but vital. A trip to the communal well was often the first order of business. Water was the heart of all morning routines. It was needed for drinking, cleaning, cooking, and even modest bathing. Clay jars, worn smooth from years of use, were slung over shoulders or balanced on heads with quiet determination. The journey to the well might have been short, perhaps just a few narrow streets away, but the return was made more difficult by the weight of the burden and the uneven stones beneath calloused feet. Back in the home, a woman might tend to the hearth. She crouched beside the still warm embers from the night before, stirring life back into the coals with a practiced hand. A few splinters of olive wood and dry brush coaxed smoke into the cool morning air. The smell of smoke was not offensive, it was life itself. Without it, there would be no warmth for boiling barley, no flame for heating the household, and no means to bake the rough, dense bread that served as the morning's first meal. Children, if not old enough to be of use elsewhere, might be sent to gather more brushwood or help knead the day's dough. Their small hands worked instinctively, more out of repetition than thought. There was no time for dawdling, no indulgent play before chores. Childhood, as we now understand it, was brief. In ancient Greece, a child was simply a small adult in training, expected to listen, to obey, and to contribute. The men, meanwhile, might gather briefly in the shade of a courtyard to discuss the day's tasks. Whether it was tending to fig trees, repairing fishing nets, or preparing goods for the agora, there was little room for idleness. Even philosophers and those inclined to talk of politics or the soul did so only after their basic responsibilities had been fulfilled. The stomach could not ponder metaphysics if it was empty. and civic duty could not be fulfilled with worn sandals or broken tools. For the laboring classes, the first journey of the day might take them into the fields, past the low stone walls and scattered patches of thistles and olive groves. The soil was dry and temperamental. Farming here was not generous. Every seed planted was a gamble, every harvest a prayer. Oxen, if available, were invaluable, though many relied on their own strength, stooped over in the sun, working the land with crude wooden plows and tools bound together with twine and stubbornness. Fishermen made their way down to the docks before the light was strong. Their small boats creaked underfoot as they pushed off, casting nets into waters they had studied since childhood. The sea, like the gods, could be cruel or kind. Some days the nets returned heavy with writhing bounty. Other days they returned with little more than seaweed and silence. Still, the work had to be done. There was no choice. Hunger didn't wait for fair winds. Women too bore the weight of early duties. In addition to tending the hearth and raising the children, they might be engaged in textile work, the spinning and weaving that clothed not only their own families, but sometimes others in the community. The rhythmic clack of looms was a kind of music, soft and persistent, echoing through quiet homes. Spinning was often done while walking, while minding children, while waiting for bread to bake. There was no idle hand. Every moment was one to be filled with usefulness. Even in wealthier homes, servants and slaves mirrored this same pattern of dawn to dusk toil. They were the unseen lifeblood of the household. They prepared meals, fetched water, cleaned refuse, and tended livestock. Their labor went unacknowledged by most, though it formed the very foundation of domestic life. Their days began early and ended late, often with little more than a shared sleeping mat in a bowl of boiled lentils. As the morning wore on, the sun climbed higher in the sky, shadows shortened, the temperature rose. The pace of activity increased, not because of urgency, but because the ancient Greek day was shaped by light. There were no electric lamps, no glowing screens. When the sun fell, work ceased, and so every moment of daylight was precious. It was chaste, not wasted. In towns and cities, the Agarath public marketplace began to buzz. Merchants arranged their goods on wooden tables or blankets spread out on the ground. There were baskets of olives, jars of honey, bolts of linen, pots of wine, and trinkets made of clay and bronze. The smells were thick and varied ripe fruit, roasting meat, the sharp tang of fish, and the musk of too many bodies in close proximity. People bartered with sharp words and narrowed eyes, every transaction a miniature drama. In the midst of it all, a crier might shout the news of the day, announcing decrees, court summons, or victories in far-off lands. Though literacy was rare among the poor, information still flowed, passed hand to hand like coin. Politics, war, and rumor spread quickly, shaping opinions and guiding conversations by the well, in the marketplace, or at the temple steps. But not everyone had time for such chatter. For the many who worked with their hands, the demands of survival left little room for reflection. Blacksmiths hammered iron with soot-blackened faces, the clang of metal ringing through alleyways. Potters shaped clay on spinning wheels, hands coated in wet earth. Builders and stonemasons hauled materials beneath the sun, sweat glistening on their backs. Each trade was an inheritance passed from father to son, each skill learned through repetition, not books. Midday brought a brief pause. A meal, simple and sparse, was shared in shaded spots. A handful of olives, a crust of bread, maybe a wedge of cheese if fortune allowed. Wine, watered down, was sipped more for hydration than celebration. Then, with no fanfare, the work resumed. The heat of the afternoon bore down like a judgment. There were no breezes in the narrow streets, no escape from the sun's glare. Skin darkened, backs ached, and hands blistered. Yet the people endured not because of any particular heroism, but because that was life. Complaints were useless. Expectations were low. Endurance was not a virtue, it was a condition of existence. As the day edged toward evening, the tone of the town softened. Tools were set aside, shutters were drawn, and courtyards filled with the smells of evening meals. The hearth once again became the center of life. Families gathered around to eat, to talk, and to rest. Laughter might be heard, but it was tired and quiet. Children dozed in corners. Women tidied the remains of dinner, and men leaned against stone walls, eyes half-lidded. Outside the town walls, the hills turned golden, then red, then dark. Stars appeared one by one, glinting in the vast silence of the night sky. The day had been long. It would be long again tomorrow. But for now, in this moment, the world slowed. Sleep came early. There were no distractions, no screens, no glowing lights, only the distant sounds of dogs barking, owls hooting, and the soft rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. The people of ancient Greece lay on mats of straw and linen, their bodies aching, their minds dulled by labor. And as they drifted into dreams of better harvests, gentler gods, and cooler days, they might briefly forget the harshness of their lives, wrapped for a few short hours in the mercy of sleep. The sun may have set on the olive groves, casting long indigo shadows across the uneven walls of clay and limestone, but peace did not come with nightfall. In the ancient world, sleep was not the gentle escape you know today. It was an uncertain pause, a shallow dozing between chores and discomfort, haunted by the whimper of livestock, the groaning of wooden beams, and the ceaseless buzzing of nighttime pests. If you think of sleep as sacred tucked in layers of cotton and feather, beneath the purr of a fan or hum of air conditioning, then brace yourself. In ancient Greece, you did not sleep so much as collapse. There were no mattresses, not really, not the kind you would call by that name. A typical bed was a wooden frame, if you were lucky, strung with leather or rope to form a sagging lattice. On this, one might throw a sack stuffed with straw, dry leaves, or, for those who could afford the luxury, coarse wool. Blankets were few and thin. More often than not, a threadbare cloak did double duty, wrapping around your body for warmth as you curled like a cat against the chill. Lice and fleas were not occasional annoyances, they were companions, ever present and impossible to fully banish. You might brush them off, scratch at the bites, boil your linens when the opportunity arose, but like the dust in your lungs or the ache in your knees, they returned, and with them came restlessness. The floor, if not swept well, could make the whole room smell of livestock. The air inside was dense, sometimes smoky from an indoor fire or oil lamp, and always tinged with the musk of bodies packed into small, poorly ventilated spaces. A family might share one-room children curled beside parents, the elderly huddled under heavy cloaks. Privacy was a foreign luxury. Personal space? Even more so. And as you tried to sleep your body sore from a long day in the fields, your skin dry or sticky from the weather, you'd hear the ceaseless music of the night, dogs barking in the distance, chickens stirring with every gust, mice scuttling in the thatch overhead, neighbors shifting in their beds or coughing in their sleep. Sometimes the wind would sneak through the shutters and rattle the wooden slats, sending up a ghostly chorus of creaks and moans. Perhaps worst of all were the insects. Mosquitoes did not respect tired eyes. They hummed around your ears, found the softest patches of skin ankles, wrists. The hollow behind your knee sand left you itching in the dark. You could swat at them, roll over, pull the blanket higher, but it wouldn't matter. They always returned. And then there were the dreams. To the ancient Greeks, dreams were not idle nonsense. They were omens, visitations, messages from the gods' sore warnings. A bad dream might mean you had angered a deity. A shadow in sleep might be a spirit. You could wake drenched in sweat not just from the heat, but from fear, unsure whether what you saw in your sleep would find you again in daylight. Superstition wove its way into the very fabric of the night. If you had a dream of falling, or one where your teeth turned to sand, would you ignore it? Or would you spend the next day fasting, praying, making offerings at the small shrine in the corner of your home? Sometimes people avoided sleep, not because they were busy or driven, but because they feared what came with it. A soldier, home from battle, might lie awake for hours, haunted not just by memories, but by the worry that the gods would visit him again. A mother, recently widowed, might hear her husband's voice whispering in the wind. And even the most rational of citizens, those who scoffed at omens during the day, might keep one eye open when the night grew too still. Insomnia wasn't medicalized, wasn't treated. It was endured. Perhaps with a warm drink of watered wine, or a whispered prayer to Hypnos, god of sleep. But if that didn't work, you simply lay there, waiting, thinking, hoping the morning would come before your thoughts grew too dark to bear. For those who did sleep soundly, there was no guarantee of rest. You might be awakened by the sound of livestock escaping, or the smell of something burning. In a world where homes were flammable, and everything from hunger to disease spread easily through the dark, sleep was never completely safe. You always had one foot, metaphorically, if not literally, to rise. And don't forget, the day began early, the rooster crowed, and work resumed whether you'd slept or not. You might rub your eyes, yawn until your jaw ached, stretch your aching limbs, and rise not into comfort, but into obligation. No coffee, no hot shower, no breakfast buffet, just stale bread, a splash of tepid water, and a long list of tasks. So ask yourself, would you survive a week with no mattress, no silence, no darkness pure enough to quiet the mind? Would you last even 3 nights on straw and stone, waking every few hours, scratching your skin raw, listening to the world creak and moan around you? Maybe you would, but not without long engaging for the gentle hum of your own modern bedroom. In your world, cleanliness is close to sacred. Showers are daily rituals. Soap comes in scented bars, foaming gels, or luxurious creams. Toothpaste is minty. Water flows freely at the twist of a tap. But if you were dropped into ancient Greece, your senses would be shocked. Hygiene wasn't absent, it simply played by very different rules. And what counted as clean would feel, by modern standards, rather grimy. To begin with, let us debunk the image of the public bath as a daily spa-like retreat. The Greeks did bathe, yes, but not like the Romans would later popularize. Public baths in classical Greece were rudimentary and not yet widespread. Bathing was more of a solitary, necessary chore than a communal indulgence. And water? It was precious, carried by hand, stored in ceramic jugs or drawn from wells. A full-body soak was a rare occasion. You might wash yourself by pouring cold water over your body, or by rubbing yourself down with olive oil and scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. It was not quite exfoliation, not quite cleansing, but something in between. The oil would loosen the grime, and the strigil would drag away the sweat and dust of the day along with a fair bit of skin. No soap, no lather, just oil, scraping, and a cloud of dirt falling to the floor in long, curling flakes. And even this was mostly for athletes, soldiers, or the upper class. A laborer in the fields might go weeks without a full body cleaning. A fisherman reeking of salt and fish might rinse his hands in seawater and call it a day. The smell of people, of bodies, was a normal part of life, a necessary one. Your teeth would ache in this world. There was no toothpaste, no dental floss. Toothpicks made from twigs, crushed charcoal, and sometimes even ash were used to clean teeth if they were cleaned at all. Dental decay was common, as was halitosis. A bright smile was a rare and painful achievement, not an expectation. Hair, too, was rarely washed. Men might keep their beards trimmed, or let them grow long in stoic pride. But shampoo didn't exist. Olive oil could be rubbed into the scalp, which helped tame the dryness, but it also attracted dust and pests. Lice were a constant companion. Women often wore their hair tied back or wrapped in fabric, partly for style, partly for sanity. And let us not forget the clothes. A tunic worn day after day, sweat-soaked and stained, might be aired out in the sun but not truly washed. Laundry was labor-intensive. Clothes were scrubbed with lye or clay, beaten on stones, and rinsed in rivers. They faded quickly, frayed easily, and were rarely soft. Wearing the same tunic for a week or two was nothing unusual. Now, consider your feet. Sandals protected little. Dirt and grime crept between your toes, hardened into calluses, and stayed there. Your toenails chipped and cracked. If you stepped on something sharp-panned, there were always sharp things lying in wait and infection might follow. A simple cut could fester, swell, and take your foot or your life. Body odor was not masked with deodorant. You might dab your skin with perfumed oil if you could afford eye trezens, myrrh, maybe even rose if you were lucky, but mostly, you simply smelled like yourself. Sun, sweat, and earth. Everyone did. The gods themselves, people believed, smelled sweet. But mortals? Mortals reeked. In the crowded streets of Athens, in the narrow alleys of Thebes, in the cramped marketplaces of Corinthian breath, was an inhale of dust, dung, fish, sweat, olives, and unwashed flesh. Your nose would never know peace, and neither would your skin. And yet, they did not consider themselves dirty. That's the dissonance. The Greeks bathed when they could. They anointed themselves. They scraped. They perfumed. Their standards, by their own terms, were respectable. But for you, born of warm showers and antibacterial soap, of hand sanitizer and freshly laundered towel sit would be a nightmare. Cleanliness was more ceremonial than scientific. You washed before entering a temple, or after a funeral, or in preparation for certain rituals, but it was about purity, not microbes. They did not know about bacteria. Germ theory would not appear for thousands of years. What made you clean was dictated by custom and gods, not hygiene or health. And let us touch on the concept of the toilet. There were no flushing toilets, no toilet paper, no tiled restrooms with glowing light bulbs and lavender soap dispensers. If you lived in a city, you might have access to a public latrinia stone bench with holes carved into it, under which waste collected in a trench. If you lived in the country, you used the field, or a pot, or a corner of the yard behind the goats. Afterwards, you might wipe with a shard of broken pottery called a pessoa. Yes, you read that correctly. Smooth, rounded ceramic pieces reused for wiping. That is, if you didn't use a handful of leaves or just your hand. There were flies. So many flies. There were no sanitary pads or modern menstrual products. Women made do with scraps of cloth, soft moss, or simply stained their garments and let it be. Menstrual blood was taboo in some places, sacred in others, but never easy to manage. Women were often excluded from rituals, temples, or certain meals during their cycles. There was shame, superstition, and always discomfort. You could, of course, try to wash off all this indignity at the end of the day, but washing meant labor. heating water over a fire, filling clay jugs, pouring carefully so none was wasted. And when you finally dried off, if you even had a clean cloth, you still dressed in the same tunic, the same undergarments, the same worn sandals. Imagine going to bed not feeling clean, but merely less dirty. Imagine waking with dust in your eyes and the taste of old oil in your mouth. Imagine never quite escaping the sensation of grime. You wouldn't survive long, not without complaint, not without longing for that first long hot shower back in your world where water flows with a handle's twist, where towels are clean and soft, where soap smells like honey, mint, or eucalyptus. Yes, the Greeks bathed, but the illusion of cleanliness was all they had. And for you, used to sterility, comfort, and spa-grade hygienate would never be enough. If you feel unwell today, headache, a fever, a strange rash, you have options. You might lie down with a glass of water, or call a doctor, visit a clinic, get a prescription, rest in air-conditioned silence with soft pillows and ibuprofen on the nightstand. In ancient Greece, however, illness was not simply a bodily matter. It was a punishment, a mystery, a sign from the gods, and the cure, often worse than the disease. Let us begin with the physicians Iatroithos, learned men of scalpels and scrolls. There were good ones, of course. Men who studied the body, recorded symptoms, and sought to balance the so-called humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. But much of Greek medicine straddled the thin line between science and superstition, and for every well-trained doctor, there were dozens more who relied on charms, guesswork, or worse, dangerous remedies. If you developed a fever in this world, the first suspicion was imbalance. Perhaps your bile had become hot, or your blood too thick. You might be bled with a sharp blade to cool the body, or given a bitter draught of crushed herbs to provoke vomiting. Diarrhea was considered healing. Perspiration was celebrated. Illness was a purge. Pain was progress. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics. Wounds were washed with wine or not at all. A deep cut might be stitched with gut and prayer, and left to fester beneath linen bandages that hadn't been boiled, only dried. Infection was common, amputation rudimentary. Gangrene was fatal, slowly. You might watch your toes blacken and fall away, while the village healer muttered incantations and applied poultices of garlic, clay, and crushed insects. Surgery, when attempted, was a brutal affair. There were no anesthetics. If you required a procedure, say, the lancing of a boil or the setting of a broken bone, you were held down, given wine or opium if lucky, and cut open while screaming. Surgical tools were bronze or iron, rarely clean, often reused. Patients were bound to wooden boards, trembling and wide-eyed, while sharp instruments probed their flesh. Consider a common ailmenta toothache. There were no dentists, no drills, no numbing agents. If your tooth decayed or cracked, the solution was simple. Remove it with pliers, or a knife, or bare hands. You might die from the infection, or the blood loss, or shock. Or, worst of all, you might survive and have to eat with the open hole in your gum, catching bits of food in pain for days, even weeks. Children were especially vulnerable. Fevers took them swiftly. A mild cough could become death. There were no vaccines, no sterile birthing rooms. Mothers gave birth in homes, sometimes in the open air, squatting over straw while midwives prayed to Artemis. If labor stalled, the mother might be bled or forced to drink foul mixtures to stimulate the womb. If that failed, both mother and child could die in slow agony. Mental illness, too, had no true treatment. Melancholy, rage, hallucinations, these were signs of spiritual imbalance. A troubled soul might be chained, exorcised, or cast out. There were no words for trauma, depression, or anxiety. You either endured it quietly or you became a pariah. And yet the Greeks believed they understood health. They believed in balance, in diet, in exercise, in fresh air. They admired symmetry in both the body and the soul. But their cures were often cruel. You might be prescribed boiled nettles for joint pain, or a diet of garlic, onions, and leeks for a cold, or be instructed to rub ash and honey into your eyes to restore vision. Some ailments were treated with amulets, others with prayers, many with fasting, some with bloodletting so intense that patients fainted and never woke up. They worshipped Asclepius, the god of healing. His temples Asclepia were scattered across Greece, acting as early hospitals. People traveled for miles to sleep in his sanctuary, hoping for divine dreams that would reveal a cure. Dogs licked their wounds. Priests administered rituals. Snakes, sacred to the god, slithered silently through the darkened corridors as patients lay shivering in the night, whispering prayers. Imagine it, you with a stomachache, or a fever, or a rash. You're brought into a smoke-filled room. A man with long hair, robes, and a bronze knife leans over you. He places his hand on your forehead, mumbles words to Apollo, examines your urine in a bowl, tastes it perhaps, then proclaims that your bile is poisoned. He reaches for his blade. You want to scream, to run, to beg for penicillin, for a hospital, for a white-coated nurse with latex gloves and a thermometer. But there is no such thing here. Only bleeding, vomiting, amputation, prayer, and in the end, often death. Or worse, a survival with a limp, a scar, a fever that never fades, a toothless mouth, a crooked back, a wound that will never fully close. You wouldn't survive it. Even if your illness didn't kill you, the cure might. So stay healthy in this Greek world of ancient medicine. Avoid the butcher with a stethoscope. Do not sneeze in public. Do not cough too loudly. Eat your lentils. Sleep when the sun sets. And pray. Above all, pray. You awaken in ancient Greece, but not to a warm bed or a cozy room, not to the soft rustle of cotton sheets or the glow of an electric lamp. Instead, the morning greets you with stillness. No hum of traffic. No chirping phone. Only the early light creeping in through a rough cloth curtain and the sounds of a rooster in the distance, echoing off stone. You slept on a thin mat last night, nothing more than a woven fabric laid across hard-packed dirt or uneven stones. There is no mattress, no memory foam. Perhaps if you're wealthy, you have a kleine, a simple wooden bed frame with a rope lattice and a cushion stuffed with hay or straw. The ropes sag, the straw pokes. The bugs, if not squashed beneath you, linger nearby in the shadow smites. Ants, even fleas. The air is cool, and you are still tired. Your back aches from the stone floor or the warped bed frame. The air is dry, and your throat is parched. You reach for a Vesselan amphora, rough and unglazed, filled with water from the communal cistern. You hope it hasn't gone stale or grown moss. There's no filtration system, just faith in the gods and your own strong stomach. You shift beneath the woolen blanketiji, heavy and often shared among family members. There's no central heating here, no insulation. The wind sneaks in through the cracks between stone bricks, hissing softly like a whisper you can't place. If it's winter, your toes are numb. If it's summer, the morning heat already clings to your skin like a damp tunic. You sit up and stretch, but not for long. There's no time for lingering, and there's certainly no such thing as comfort. No chairs, no slouching, no peace. There are no sofas in this world, no plush recliners or beanbags. If you sit, you do so on a wooden stool, a flat stone, or directly on the ground. The concept of leisure furniture does not exist. You rest in a crouch, kneel beside the hearth, or lean against the wall. If you're a woman, comfort is rarer still. Your day is spent near the hearth, where smoke drifts into your eyes and nose, where you kneel to grind grain or prepare meals for others. Your knees ache, your lower back burns. But this is life. You don't complain. Complaints are for the lazy or the sick. Children have no toys but sticks and stones, and perhaps an old doll made from rags. They play in dirt, chase insects, climb uneven rocks and rooftops. Laughter still exists, but it's tinged with fatigue and dirt. Their feet are calloused by age 5. No privacy, no solitude. Your home has no rooms, just a main living space and perhaps a storage corner. There are no doors, only hanging cloths. No windows, only slits for light and air. Everyone hears everything. If one child stirs at night, all stir. If one person is sick, all must hear the coughs and groans. There is no silence except in the dead of night, and even then, animals may stir outside, and the wind may moan through the hills. If you must relieve yourself, you step outside with a clay pot. The toilet is a hole, shared with neighbors or household. The flies buzz, the smell clings. There's no toilet paper, only water, or rags if you're lucky. There is no bath awaiting you, only a basin. Perhaps a public bath if you live in a city, shared by many and cleaned by none. You splash cold water on your face, scrub your hands with sand or ash. A luxury is warm water from the fire, poured into a basin and used sparingly. The idea of a shower, of soap that smells like lavender or peppermint, is fiction. No distractions, no escape. There are no books, not in the way you know them. There is no library in your home, no novels on your shelf. The few scrolls that exist belong to the educated elite, written in wax or ink, hand-copied by scribes. You do not read them. You cannot. There is no radio, no music streaming in the background. If you want music, you sing or listen to someone plucking a lyre. If you want a story, you wait for a traveler or bard. The silence is long and deep, filled only by the occasional conversation, the low hum of bees, the bark of a distant dog. The day stretches out ahead like a long road you've walked 1,000 times before. Labor in lieu of leisure. There is no such thing as a lazy morning. You rise because there is work to be done, and always more work. If you are poor, your hands are your income. You clean, carry, chop, dig, sew. You make your own clothes. Your sandals, if you own any, are worn thin. The Menef Freemite walk to the agora, the public square, to listen, barter, or argue politics. But not all men. Many laborers, craftsmen, and farmers have no time for debate. Their comfort is a figment, something you might glimpse in your neighbor's window and envy. The women stay behind, bound by the unwritten law of silence and place. Their domain is the kitchen, the loom, the jar of oil that must be portioned carefully so it does not run out before market day. The elderly? They are weary. There is no retirement, only a slowing of pace until the body cannot rise with the sun. Some continue to work until death. Others are quietly set aside. The unyielding ground. At night you do not ease into a feathered mattress. You return to your mat or rope bed. You fold yourself into the same cramped position. Your joints creak. There are no fluffy pillows, only a rolled cloth or perhaps a padded stone headrest. You sleep in your clothes or wrapped in a cloak. There is no central fire unless someone tends it. The darkness is total. Perhaps you dream of a better world, a soft couch, a cup of tea, a warm blanket. But when you wake, your back will remind you you are in ancient Greece. You wouldn't last a week. Your modern body, coddled by cushions, spoiled by softness, and comforted by temperature control, would struggle to survive a day, let alone a lifetime, in this world. Here, comfort is a myth, leisure is rare, and the ground, hard and unyielding, is your companion from cradle to grave. So as you lie down tonight in your real bed, soft, quiet, warm, grateful for every spring, every thread, every layer of modern luxury. Because if you were born 2,000 years ago, you would be staring at the stone ceiling, listening to the rats scurry in the corner, and counting the hours until another long, aching day began. Sleep came uneasily in the ancient Greek world. The stars turned slowly over the rooftops of stone homes and modest clay dwellings, their dim light barely piercing the slatted shutters or worn cloth coverings that shielded windows from the winds. In wealthier homes, cushioned mattresses and woolen blankets offered a measure of comfort, but for most, nighttime was a return to the earth-simple mats. Animal hides or even bare floor served as beds, and the cold stones absorbed the chill of the night like a sponge. The sounds of the city never vanished completely. Even after the sun dipped beyond the hills and the pale pink glow faded into twilight, there remained the occasional bray of a mule, the sharp cry of a restless infant, or the creaking of shutters in the breeze. These were not so much disturbances as part of the background of life, constant companions in a world where silence was rare and full darkness save, for the moonless nights was the domain of stories and fears. In the dim glow of olive oil lamps, families wound down. The rich might sip diluted wine and discuss the day's dealings, reclining on woven couches, while slaves cleared the remains of their meals in the shadows. In humbler homes, the family might simply huddle together, warmth shared as much by proximity as by any blanket. There were no evening news reports, no novels, or printed distractions-only conversation, simple rituals, and the slow extinguishing of flames before the surrender to dreams. But even rest in ancient Greece was dictated by class, weather, and age. The elderly, worn from a life of toil or illness, might sleep deeply out of sheer exhaustion. Children were often first to succumb to sleep, their days filled with chores and curiosity. For young men training for war or athletes preparing for competition, sleep was a matter of recovery. And for women who often rose before dawn and worked until well after dusk, sleep was a quiet, necessary mercy. Those who lived in the countryside had a different experience altogether. Without the proximity of city noise, the night was filled instead with the rustle of trees, the far-off howls of wolves, and the chirp of insects, an ancient chorus of wilderness that reminded every sleeper of their nearness to nature and their vulnerability to it. The fire at the hearth would be banked but never fully extinguished, glowing coals left behind like red eyes in the dark, just in case. Some feared the night. Sleep, after all, was a cousin of death in Greek thought. The god Hypnos, twin of Thanatos, was said to visit the minds of men when their bodies fell still. To sleep was to flirt with the underworld, if only briefly. Nightmares were more than the product of indigestion or fatigue. They were messages, omens, or divine punishments. A restless night could mean more than mere discomfort. It might be a sign of something cosmic. Dream interpretation became a quiet craft. Priests and seers occasionally offered guidance, reading the murky language of the subconscious like tea leaves. A dream of fire might mean loss. A dream of a snake could signify betrayal or healing, depending on context. Most people, however, did not consult oracles. They simply endured their visions in silence, brushing them off like smoke at sunrise. And then there were those who could not sleep at all, Anxiety, though not understood as it is today, still stalked the ancient world. Farmers wondered whether the rain would come in time. Merchants fretted over debts and shipments, and parents lay awake counting the ways a child might fall ill. The pressure of daily survival gnawed at the mind, and for some, rest was elusive. They might rise and sit by the embers, poking the coals with a stick, whispering prayers to Hermes or Hestia, or simply staring into the darkness as if it might blink first. The rhythm of the night changed with the seasons. In winter, night stretched long and bitter, forcing families to rise later and conserve fuel. In summer, the warmth lingered into the night, making rest a sweaty ordeal, especially in crowded dwellings. Mosquitoes thrived in stagnant water, creeping into open doorways and buzzing like omens. Some people slept on rooftops to catch a breeze, wrapped in cloaks and staring at the stars until exhaustion took them. Slaves often slept near the hearth or by the door, both for warmth and security. Their rest was interrupted by the needs of the household fetching water, tending fires, or responding to their master's call. For them, sleep was not a right but a borrowed luxury. Any prolonged rest came only after the masters were satisfied, the children soothed, and the chores complete. There were no clocks, no alarms. Time was measured by the body and the sky. Roosters marked the earliest moments of dawn, their cries heralding a new cycle of toil. The scent of smoke would rise from the hearth again, the clatter of pots, and the scrape of sandals on stone slowly waking the village. But in these last hours of night, when the world hovered in liminality, there was a quietness ancient and unbroken, a moment where even the gods seemed to pause and draw breath. In this world, survival wasn't just a matter of waking and working. It required navigating the long silences, the creeping cold, and the restless ghosts of thought that haunted the sleeping mind. Sleep was not a refuge. It was a necessity wrapped in fear and faith, in bodily exhaustion and whispered myths. And if you could not sleep, you stared at the ceiling, at the shadows, and waited for the rooster to rescue you from your own racing thoughts. In ancient Greece, the night was never entirely safe. It held too many stories, too many unknowns. And in a world where light was precious and time was marked by the stars, every moment of rest was earned. You wouldn't survive the night on comfort alone. You'd survive it with the hope that morning would command with it another chance to endure. The life of a child in ancient Greece was not one of leisure, nor was it filled with toys, sweets, or gentle encouragement. Childhood was short, often precarious, and shaped not by indulgence, but by duty to the family, to the city-state, and to the unrelenting expectations of adulthood. From the moment a child drew breath, their place in the world was defined not by dreams, but by the roles society demanded they play. There were rituals, of course. A child was not merely born, they were presented. For boys, the 5th or 7th day brought the amphidromia, a quiet naming ceremony. If the father accepted the child into the household, they were carried around the hearth, the symbolic heart of the family. But acceptance was not guaranteed. Infants were frequently exposed left outside the city walls if they were ill, deformed, or simply unwanted. It was not a private tragedy, but a practical act rooted in necessity and belief. Life was hard, and only the strong, the useful, or the fortunate would survive. For those who remained, childhood unfolded like a slow rehearsal for adult struggle. Boys and girls led separate lives, shaped by different futures. For girls, education was domestic and silent. They learned to weave and spin, to grind grain and fetch water, to obey and serve. A girl might never learn to read, but she would know the weight of a full water jug by the age of 5. Her day might begin with the sunrise and end long after the last fire was banked. There were no school books, but the loom was her lesson, the spindle her test. Boys were not exempt from hardship, though their trials took different forms. In Athens, the wealthy might attend a grammatistes, where they would learn their letters by tracing them in wax or sand. Their lessons were conducted aloud, rhythmically chanted like prayers. Reading was not silent, words were spoken and heard. They learned from Homer, reciting the lines of Achilles and Odysseus until the verses became muscle memory. Writing was done with a stylus, slow and careful, across brittle wax tablets. One error, and the line had to be scraped smooth and started again. Music was part of a boy's schooling. The lyre, the alosa, kind of double pipe, these were not mere entertainment but tools of discipline. Rhythm, timing, and harmony were believed to shape the soul, to tame the passions of youth and prepare them for the responsibilities of men. A young boy might spend hours plucking the same string, guided by a strict tutor who spoke more with his stick than his smile. Physical training was central. The paidiatha, complete education of a Greek malawas, not simply intellectual but bodily. Wrestling, running, javelin, discusal were required. At the palestra, the boys trained under the watchful eye of older men. They trained nude, not out of vanity, but because the body was seen as a sculpture in progress, a vessel of virtue and strength. There was no privacy in these lessons, and little kindness. Injuries were common. Bruises, scrapes, even broken bones, these were badges of honor, proof of effort. A boy who cried was weak. A boy who complained was shamed. Endurance was the first lesson and the last. In Sparta, this was taken to extremes. A Spartan boy's life was not his own. Taken from his family at age 7, he entered the agoge, the state-run military training program. There were no parents, only trainers, no beds, only reeds, no meals unless they were stolen. Pain was constant, hunger was routine. The boys learned to fight, to steal, to endure beatings without flinching. They were taught not just to obey, but to dominate. To hesitate was to fail. Compassion was a liability. A Spartan boy who survived to adulthood had become a weapon. But not all learning was formal. Much of what a child absorbed came from the world around them, the endless labor, the rigid hierarchies, the gods who watched and judged. They learned through observation and repetition. A boy might learn to trade from his father's stall in the agora, counting out coins, or haggling over oil. A girl might learn to soothe a baby from her mother, holding her younger siblings while the older women kneaded bread or fetched kindling. Play existed, but it was spare. Children played with hoops, with knuckle bones, with rudimentary dolls of clay or rags. But these moments were fleeting, tucked between chores or errands. There were no school breaks, no summer holidays. The seasons brought labor, not leisure. Harvest, planting, cleaning, carrying the calendar of a child was always marked by work. Even religion played a role in their upbringing. Boys participated in rites of Apollo or Hermes, girls in the mysteries of Artemis or Demeter. These were not casual affairs. Festivals like the Arctea involved young girls living for a time in temple service, mimicking bears in ritual dances. Boys walked in sacred processions, bore offerings, or slaughtered animals in sacrifice. It was not a question of belief, it was culture, identity, obligation. To know the gods was to know one's place. Discipline came swiftly. A child who misbehaved could expect beatings not from parents alone, but from any adult in the community. Teachers, neighbors, even strangers had the right to correct a wayward youth. The concept of childhood innocence was foreign. Children were not to be nurtured but shaped, like iron in the forge. Illness was common. With no knowledge of bacteria, no access to antibiotics, a simple fever could become fatal. Mothers whispered charms against disease, made offerings at temples, or consulted local healers who offered roots, honey, and prayer. Death was always near. Many children did not survive infancy. Those who did might still be lost to plague, infection, or accident. There were no guarantees. Every birthday was a small defiance of the odds. And yet, there were moments of joy. A good harvest brought sweetness figs, nuts, or honey cakes at a festival. A family in good standing might present their child at the apertura, a public acknowledgement of their rightful place. On festival days, children danced in the streets, sang with the chorus, or rode on small carts decorated with garlands. Laughter echoed even in the narrow alleys, and for a moment the burden of growing up was forgotten. But such moments passed quickly. Puberty arrived early, and with it came expectation. Girls were married off in their early teens, often to men much older. They left their father's home for another, their dolls offered to Artemis as a farewell to childhood. Boys, once they had reached their majority, were expected to vote, fight, and provide. The cloak of youth was discarded with little ceremony. There was no adolescence in ancient Greece, no long pause between child and adult. One day you were a boy, the next a soldier. One moment you were a girl, the next a wife. And society asked nothing less than full transformation. So why wouldn't you survive childhood in ancient Greece? Not because of a lack of toys or comforts, but because childhood itself was not a protected sanctuary. It was a gauntlet, a test of physical resilience, social conformity, and relentless instruction. In such a world, to grow up was not to dream, but to endure. And for many, simply surviving to adulthood was the first and greatest achievement of all. The sun rose in the clear Mediterranean sky, casting its warm glow upon a world that so often offered little warmth to those who had lived long enough to feel the years in their bones. In ancient Greece, there was no word for retirement as we know it. Old age was not a time of ease and repose. It was a slow unraveling of the body and, sometimes, the mind, made all the more harrowing by the absence of any real cushion from life's harder edges. Pain was a daily companion, and dignity a luxury not always afforded. An old man, his spine bowed like a question mark, shuffled across a packed earth courtyard. His steps were slow and uncertain. Each joint moved with the reluctant grind of wear, his knees puffed and sore, hips stiff and aching. In his youth, he had perhaps been a soldier, a farmer, or a sailor. His body had once moved with the grace of the young, strength flowing through muscles now shrunken and slack. But age, that pitiless sculptor, had chipped away at him for decades, leaving behind a fragile remnant of the man he used to be. He paused by a cistern, dipping a cracked bowl into the water and sipping. The coolness offered little relief. His gums ached where teeth had once held firm. Most were gone now, lost to time and decay, and chewing anything tougher than soft porridge was a misery. He ate less than he used to, not by choice, but by limitation. Hunger was a steady shadow, one that mocked his attempts at satisfaction. A boiled turnip or a few olives might fill his stomach, but never truly satiate. His wife had passed seasons ago, taken by a cough that grew worse in winter and never improved. They had lived together in a narrow stone house, its small hearth now cold most nights. Alone, he relied on neighbors when they remembered. Charity was not a civic right, but a matter of luck and reputation. If you had been well liked in life, you might be granted a bowl of lentils or a crust of barley bread by a kindly neighbor. If not, you went without. There was no such thing as a doctor in the modern sense. Healers existed, yes, but they were scarce. And their knowledge, while sometimes astonishing, was as often vague and rooted in theory more than evidence. A healer might recommend a compress of boiled herbs or a draught of wine mixed with honey and crushed laurel. Sometimes these helped. More often the pains simply persisted. His hands, once capable of lifting amphorae and working wood, now curled stiffly in the mornings. He wrapped them in linen and dipped them in warm oil when he could afford it. But the pain remained. In Athens, some older men found purpose in the agora, sitting in shaded corners and sharing stories or debating philosophy. But this man was not of that class. He was not a citizen philosopher or a retired hoplite with a pension. He was poor, and for the poor, old age was a slow, inescapable collapse. He was not alone in his suffering. An old woman in another part of the polis sat hunched on a stool outside her home, a spindle of wool in her lap. Her eyesight had dimmed and her hands trembled, but she worked slowly, methodically. The wool was coarse and uneven, but it would bring a few obols at the market. She could not stop. To stop would mean to vanish. There was no home for the aged, no shelter beyond the walls of one's own making. So she worked. Every thread was a strand of survival. Sometimes she was visited by grandchildren, the product of her daughter's line. They came not often and not for long. The young had no time for the old, and little patience for the slow stories and slower movements of those who reminded them of their own inevitable future. When they did visit, they brought noise and energy, which faded quickly after they left. She would sit quietly in their absence, the spindle in her lap, her ears straining for the next familiar knock on the wooden door. Sickness in old age was especially cruel. With no antibiotics, no surgery, no organized care, even a mild illness could stretch into weeks of agony. A chest infection might become a death sentence. A fall could break a hip beyond repair. Fevers brought delirium. Without teeth, food became dangerous, choking an ever-present threat. And the body, worn thin by years of physical labor and nutritional want, had no reserves left to fight. Yet there was also resilience. The old had seen wars, droughts, plagues, and the deaths of children and neighbors. They had survived on boiled weeds and rainwater during lean seasons. They had buried lovers and friends and kept on. They were not pampered, but neither were they entirely forgotten. Some had built small networks of trust neighbors who shared firewood or passed along scraps of boiled meat. Others relied on the goodwill of temple priests, who sometimes distributed alms after festivals or ceremonies. Still, their days were mostly quiet, punctuated by the aches of their own bodies and the memories of those who had gone before. In the stillness of their simple homes, with their thatched roofs and bare stone walls, they recalled better days when their backs had not bent, when their hands had not trembled. They remembered the clamor of the agora, the bright laughter of children, the smell of olive oil crackling over flame. At night, sleep did not come easily. Hard beds of straw or worn mats offered little comfort to joints inflamed by age. There was no soft mattress, no warmth from modern heating. Some curled close to the hearth if they could afford a bit of wood. Others simply wrapped themselves tightly in old wool, shivering through the darkness. Yet even in this, there was a strange beauty. In the quiet, they knew themselves. They remembered what the young had not yet learned, that life was never easy, but always worth continuing. That every sunrise was a kind of triumph. That survival, however painful, was still its own kind of honor. And so they carried on. Day after day, the old man with his bent frame and aching bones, The old woman with her trembling fingers and hollow eyes, not revered, not pampered but enduring, as the ancients always had. In the pantheon of ancient Greek life, one class stood silently at the bottom of the social ladder: the poor, the laborers, the ones whose names were never etched into marble or remembered in grand myths. Their stories did not echo through amphitheaters or appear in Plato's dialogues. They left no gilded tombs, no statues in the agora, and yet they were the lifeblood of the polis. Without them, the columns of temples would never rise, the ships would never sail, and the fields would remain barren. To be poor in ancient Greece was not simply a matter of having less. It was a sentence, a birthright often inescapable, handed down like a curse from one generation to the next. There was no safety net, no universal relief, no organized system of welfare. If you were born into poverty, you worked every day, without end, until your body could give no more. And when it did, you faded into the quiet margins of history. At sunrise, a poor man would rise from a bed of straw, if he had one, or a blanket laid on packed dirt if he did not. He lived in a single-room home, a narrow structure made of mud brick or unpainted stone, its roof perhaps of reeds or clay tiles. Smoke from his small hearth lingered in the stale air, seeping into his clothes and lungs. There was little light, a tiny slit for a window, maybe a door that creaked on its hinges. His children, if they were still with him, lay curled together nearby, their stomachs whispering of hunger even in sleep. His first thoughts were not philosophical musings about truth or virtue. They were questions of sustenance. Had he enough barley to grind into flour? Would the neighbor sell him a few figs on credit? Was there oil left in the amphora? Or would he need to beg the temple priests again? If he was strong and lucky, he might find day labor. The agora sometimes buzzed with men in need of quick hand someone to carry stones, dig a trench, patch a roof, unload a cart of pottery, but there were more poor men than jobs. Many waited each morning at the fringes of the agora, eyes scanning every merchant and landowner for a sign, a gesture. Hope every morning, followed by resignation most afternoons. The work, when it came, was brutal. Under a hot sun that showed no mercy, he heaved and bent and sweated, his hands calloused and split. There was no safety gear, no brakes, no labor laws. If he fell from a roof, it was his fault. If he injured his hand lifting stones, the pain was his to bear. Employers paid only for completed work. There was no pay for the injured or the weary. For women, the burden was no lighter. Poor women rose early, tending to hearth and children, grinding grain with weary arms, fetching water from distant fountains, mending garments until their eyes stung. If their husband had died or disappeared, they might turn to spinning wool for a few coins or try to sell herbs and trinkets at the market. Some, when desperation outweighed shame, turned to prostitution not as a profession, but as a last resort to feed their family. And still it was not enough. Hunger was always nearby. A loaf of bread, once stale, might be softened with olive oil if you had any. Lentils, onions, and boiled greens formed the staples of the poor. Meat was rare, often only seen during festivals when sacrifices were made and scraps distributed to the crowd. Wine, when available, was watered down to make it last. Most drank plain water, or whatever passed for it in the cisterns and wells. Disease, of course, was rampant among the poor. With no physicians to tend to them and no time to rest, illness was endured, not treated. A cough could linger for months. Diarrhea from bad water might leave a child lifeless in days. There were no hospitals, only the kindness of strangers or the healing hands of a local woman with a few herbs and whispered prayers. Their homes were flammable and cold, their garments coarse and patched. Shoes were a luxury, Most walked barefoot through streets, littered with refuse, animal droppings, and chamber pot slop. Their feet cracked and bled. Their backs ached. Their lives moved in quiet rhythm swake. Labor, eat if able, sleep, repeat. And yet, even among the poorest there was spirit. A shared bowl of porridge, a child's laughter, a neighbor helping another patch a wall. They gathered during festivals, standing in the crowds, straining to see the dancers or hear the music. For a few hours, they might feel part of something larger than their toil. During religious processions, they marched two heads held high, if only for a day. The gods, they believed, saw them. The poor prayed as often, perhaps more often than the rich, to Hermes for good luck, to Demeter for a full granary, to Asclepios for healing. The altars in their homes were small, often no more than a shelf with a terracotta figure and a bit of olive oil, but they offered what they could: a flower, a piece of bread, a drop of wine. They hoped that the gods would remember them, even if Athens did not. And what of their children? Some would escape poverty through luck, or marriage, or the rare generosity of a wealthy patron. But most would inherit the same burden, the same struggle. Sons became laborers. Daughters became housewives or servants. The wheel turned, slow and unchanging. But even among the hard-packed dust and weary days they endured. The poor had no philosophers to speak for them, but they carried the city. They built the walls. They plowed the fields. They shaped the clay and cleaned the streets. They were the pulse beneath the marble the breath that kept Greece alive. And as the stars rose each night over their simple homes, they lay down again on thin mats, their bodies sore, their stomachs never quite full, but their will unbroken. They had no epics written about them, but theirs was the quietest and most heroic struggle of all. At last, we take for granted the idea of a stable legal system and a police force. In ancient Greece, forget it. Justice was arbitrary, punishments were hideously brutal, and the law was often just a weapon for the rich and powerful. In early Athens, the first written laws came from a lawmaker named Draco. His name gave us the word draconian for a reason. His laws were said to be written not in ink, but in blood. The death penalty was the punishment for almost everything, including things we'd consider minor. Stealing a cabbage could get you executed. When asked why, Draco supposedly said that minor crimes deserved death, and he couldn't think of a worse punishment for major ones. Later reforms softened these laws, but the system remained deeply unfair. Only adult male citizens had full legal rights. Women, foreigners, and slaves couldn't represent themselves in court. If you were wronged, it was up to you to find the criminal, gather evidence, and prosecute them in front of a court of your fellow citizens. There was no police force to call. This meant that justice was really only available to people with the time, money, and influence to pursue it. Punishments were brutal. Long-term imprisonment wasn't really a thing. Why would this city pay to feed a criminal? Instead, you faced massive fines. If you couldn't pay, you could be forced into debt slavery. Exile was another common sentence, casting you out of your home forever. For serious crimes, the death penalty was carried out in gruesome ways. One method was apotympanismos, where a person was fastened to a plank and left to die of exposure and starvation over several days. Another, of course, was being forced to drink poison from the hemlock plant, the fate of Socrates. Imagine a world with no police, where stealing food to survive carried the same penalty as murder. The law wasn't there to protect you. It was a dangerous game, and if you lost, the consequences were final. No discussion of ancient Greece is complete without confronting its most horrific institution, slavery. The democracy of Athens, the philosophy of Plato, The art of the Parthenon of it was built on the backs of hundreds of thousands of enslaved human beings. It wasn't some minor part of the economy, it was the engine that powered the entire society. In a city like Athens, it's estimated that as many as 1 in every 3 or 4 people was a slave. Your odds of being a slave were just as high as being a free citizen. How did you become a slave? You could be captured in war. You could be snatched by pirates. You could be born into it if your mother was a slave. You were a slave for life. Once you were a slave, you stopped being a person. You were property. An animate tool, as Aristotle chillingly put it. You could be bought and sold at a market like livestock. You had no rights, couldn't own anything, and your family could be torn apart and sold off at any moment. Your owner had absolute power over you. The work was often hell on earth. The most dreaded fate was being sent to the silver mines at Lorien, which funded the Athenian Empire. Slaves, including children, were forced into narrow, dark tunnels deep underground, chipping away at rock. The air was thick with toxic lead dust, and collapses were common. It was a death sentence. Few who went into the mines ever came out alive. Physical and sexual abuse were just a part of life. A master could beat or torture his slave with no consequences. In Sparta, the treatment of the state-owned slaves, the helots, was particularly sadistic. To terrorize the helots, who vastly outnumbered them, the Spartans would ritually beat them every year and annually declare war on them, allowing young Spartan men to legally murder any helot they found as a kind of twisted rite of passage. Surviving this system meant crushing every ounce of your own hope and dignity. It was a living nightmare from which there was almost no escape. This was the dark foundation upon which the gleaming marble temples were built. So, really, could you have survived in ancient Greece? Let's be honest. You'd wake up in a filthy home to a meal of bland gruel. You'd drink water that could kill you and see doctors whose cures were just a different roll of the dice. Your days would be filled with back-breaking labor, either as a free farmer one bad harvest away from starvation, or as a slave whose body wasn't even your own. You'd live under the constant shadow of war, knowing you could be called to fight and die with whatever shoddy gear you could afford. You'd face a legal system where justice was for the rich, and stealing an apple could be a death sentence. And through it all, you'd be part of a society kept afloat by the soul-crushing misery of a massive enslaved population. The golden age of Greece was golden for a tiny, privileged few. For everyone else, it was an age of iron-hard, cold, and unforgiving. The glorious stories we hear are one side of a coin, and on the other is a world of squalor, brutality, and despair. The comforts, safety, and basic human rights we take for granted simply didn't exist. So when you picture the Parthenon, remember the stinking streets below. When you think of Socrates, remember the slaves dying in the silver mines who gave him the leisure to think. The ancient Greece of our imagination is a fantasy. The real one would have broken you. What part of ancient Greek life do you think would be the hardest to survive? The food, the wars, the lack of sanitation. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy uncovering the dark, forgotten truths of history, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.